to the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak about an issue that's very important to the people of Higgins, and that is our recognition of our Indigenous Australians and the wonderful culture that has stretched back more than 60,000 years, the longest living culture on this planet. Mr Deputy Speaker, as Australians, we know that Indigenous Australians have, unfortunately, poorer outcomes than we would hope for. And that is across a whole range of different areas. This includes poor outcomes for health, in education, in housing, in jobs, youths in detention. The list goes on. And Mr Deputy Speaker, it's not easy to tackle these problems. But the Morrison government is doing this by allowing Indigenous voices to work with government. It's an essential part of the way the government has decided to work in a co-design process. Too long, Mr Deputy Speaker, governments have done things to Indigenous Australians, not with Indigenous Australians. This government has taken an approach where we have worked with numerous practical changes by collaborating with Indigenous leaders and having a grassroots approach, so that meaningful changes can be made that symbolise our fundamental importance of Indigenous culture to Australia and its history, but more importantly, practical changes that help close the gap on the inequities that Indigenous Australians have faced for decades. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Morrison government last year released the first Closing the Gap implementation plan, along with $1 billion in new measures to help achieve the outcomes. This includes $378 million for a new redress scheme for stolen generation survivors from the Northern Territory, the Australian Capital Territory and Jervis Bay Territory. And I'm proud to be a member of the National Redress Committee that helps oversee this redress scheme, as I note that Mr Deputy Speaker himself is also a member. These these schemes are so important to the long and ongoing healing process. We have to recognise the injustices of the past. We have to deal with the ongoing injustices. This is no small step forward, but it is an important step. An additional $254 million towards infrastructure to better support Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations, affectionately known as ARCHOs. This government is also investing $160 million in new funding to ensure the best start in life for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children through initiatives such as the Healthy Mums and Healthy Bubs program, the Community Childcare Fund and the Connect Beginnings program and Early Years Education program. Mr Deputy Speaker, many decades ago now, when I was a medical student, I spent time in the Northern Territory in Arnhem Land. And it's so great to hear that the early pilot programs that were started in those days are now properly and formally federally funded to make sure that the best services can be provided to our newest and youngest Indigenous Australians. This government is also providing increased investment in the Commonwealth's existing Indigenous Languages and Arts program and funding for additional language centres to protect the most at-risk Indigenous languages. Mr Deputy Speaker, anybody who's been to rural and remote parts of Australia understands that these languages are at risk of being lost. There are many hundreds of languages in the Indigenous languages, and to maintain and support them is incredibly important to upholding the richness and diversity of Indigenous Australian culture. So supporting the establishment of a joined-up policy partnership on justice to agree on focus areas for action to derive outcomes on reducing Indigenous incarceration is also another important area that I know in particular the Attorney-General, the Honourable Michaela Cash, has at the heart of some of the things that she is doing. We will continue to work to close the gap, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I know that this is a bipartisan wish of this parliament. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, in my first speech, I said a strong country is one that is at peace with its past. Non-Indigenous Australians do care deeply about how we show respect to our Indigenous Australians. And this is why the Morrison government has enacted a number of different changes in the last few years, which are symbolic and partner with the practical aspect of the Closing the Gap investments that have been made. And one of those is the recent change a year ago now to our national anthem from Young and Free, which doesn't reflect the multicultural and Indigenous Australian cultural aspects of our country, but from Young and Free to One and Free, which is much more inclusive of the fact that we are part of, we can partner with a long Indigenous culture that goes back so many thousands, tens of thousands of years. Like the Prime Minister has said, it takes nothing away, but it adds so much. It recognises the distance that we have travelled as a nation and that we still have a place to go. It recognises that our national story is drawn from more than 300 national ancestries and language groups, and we are the most successful multicultural nation on earth, and we must continue to strive to do better to ensure that we are all inclusive of our diverse multicultural heritage. It reaffirms our resolve as one of the world's oldest democracies while honouring the foundations upon which our nation has been built and the aspirations we share for the future. Mr Deputy Speaker, for the last 25 years, the Australian Aboriginal flag has been troubled by copyright claims, effectively rendering the flag private property. As such, the flag could not be used without permission granted and royalties paid, of course not in the least fostering the sense of pride and love that is required for us to embrace the Indigenous flag for all Australians. And in light of this, the Australian Government has moved to set the Aboriginal flag free. And the Commonwealth now holds a copyright, and the flag now belongs to everyone, and no one can take that away. The Aboriginal flag will now be managed in a similar manner to the Australian national flag, where its use is free, but it must be presented in a respectful and dignified way. This means all Australians can now put the Aboriginal flag on apparel, such as sports jerseys and shirts, without having to ask for permission or pay a fee. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the third aspect I'd like to talk about is Nguru, which is an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural precinct which has just been funded by the federal government, which is to be built in the Parliamentary Triangle. And this will be an important, meaningful place where learning and knowledge can centre around a national resting place to care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait ancestral remains, and a new home for the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I was honoured to have the Minister for Indigenous Australians, in fact the first Indigenous Australian who is Minister for Indigenous Australians, the Honourable Ken Wyatt, visit Higgins just last week. His approach to his portfolio, which is gentle and reflectful and respectful, brought with us this understanding that all Australians are on the journey of healing and peace with regards to Indigenous Australians, and the concept of yarning, which is walking together and talking together. And we had many visits. One was to the King David School, where we viewed the federally funded Indigenous mural painted by senior school students and First Nations artists together. And we discussed their school's reconciliation action plan and the importance of closing the gap with their very impressive community school leaders, Alex Cohen, the granddaughter of the great Australian Sir Zelwyn Cohen, and Ari Epstein, along with Principal Mark Light. The King David has developed a vision statement in conjunction with parents and students, and they are to be congratulated on the work they are doing in Indigenous recognition. Ken Wyatt also came to visit, or the Minister also came to visit Herring Island, where we received an impromptu and knowledgeable guided tour from Adolfo from Parks Victoria, and shared his in-depth knowledge about the Indigenous sculptures across the island. And lastly, we visited Armour House, where we finished the tour, and we were greatly warmed by the welcoming ceremony from Uncle Steve. We shared a coffee while hearing stories and spoke in a yarning circle with CEO Marg about initiatives of change and their commitment to teaching about our long and rich Indigenous history and culture. At every visit, Mr Deputy Speaker, Minister Wyatt listened and shared insightful learnings of his time as Minister for Indigenous Australians. We're very fortunate to have such a rockstar minister who's working in a very important portfolio. Lastly, I'd like to mention, Mr Deputy Speaker, about the federal government delivering on its commitment to co-design an Indigenous voice that would provide a way for Indigenous Australians to provide advice and input on matters that are important to improve their lives. The government has allocated funding to the co-design process, and following extensive co-design led by 52 members involving more than 9,400 people and organisations, the Indigenous Voice co-design final report was delivered just in December 2021. These are very important initiatives, and I welcome the changes that have been made, the recognition of the importance of Indigenous Australians to all of Australia. There's so much more that we have to do, but Australians have a strong sense of pride in our country, and this needs to include embracing, understanding and caring about our Indigenous Australians. We will work every day to make our country more united and more inclusive. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Member Ford.